Let's come to symbols transform as vision, and this is presentation 7. We spent a whole annual cycle, 4 seasons, with a phase for each of the seasons to discover how it is that nature actually happens, how nature works. And we found that from the mysterious beginnings of nature, it comes all the way through 4 phases of nature, rituals, which establish existence by actions, selected and precise. And then myth, which is mythic experience where feelings and images and language occur and create experience. And that as experience deepens, it acquires meaning, which then symbols integrate and make thought, make a mind. And that for most life, that's as far as it goes. But for our kind, there is a very special quality that happens. That the mind, instead of being the end of nature, becomes transparent. And the individuality who has that mind discovers that they can look through their mind because it's now transparent. And what they're able to see are visions that are literally supernatural. They don't occur any place in the natural ecology. They occur outside, as it were. And in microbiology and genetics, we're sophisticated enough by 2005 to know that the structure of certain molecules in life, one of the largest classes of them are glycoproteins, which when life gets to the complexity that it's able to have tens of thousands of glycoproteins, it can manufacture very complex organisms like the human body, which will work on trillions of levels of activity at the same time. A fantastic computer. But one of the qualities of glycoproteins is that they have domains outside of the membrane of the molecular structure. They're called transmembrane domains. And for glycoproteins, there are 7 of these. And these domains outside of the membrane walls of the proteins act as extensions of those proteins so that other proteins can come and join them temporarily and make an integral structure, but one which is not built just from nature, but it's built from a bringing together of 2 things that were made in nature and now come together and form something new. And when those kinds of proteins join together, the structure now has not just an integral structure, but it has a ratioed structure. And the fact that they're ratioed means that proportionality now becomes as important as the integral balance. And the proportional qualities extend that. The way in which structures are not just natural, but they're able to function on the other side of the limitations of nature. And so life has evolved ways in which we now can evolve in vision which is outside the mind. It's not limited to the body, not limited to the mind. And so the ancient way to talk about it is that we now have a spirit. And that the spirit is not limited to the body, not limited to the mind, but can be in them, but also can go out of them without destroying them, without leaving them behind. In ancient shamanic times, this was the spirit journey, going out from the body, going out from the mind. And after tens of thousands of years of having that capacity, there were men and women, quite a long time ago, more than 40,000 years ago, who discovered that in that visionary capacity of the spirit, it has the same kind of capacity that nature has and that experience has. Nature can make forms of existence, and experience can make forms of thought. Vision can make forms of art. And so art was born for the first time about 40,000 years ago. The capacity to make forms that were supernatural forms, they're spiritual forms. And one of the concomitants that we're looking at now is that when the capacity to make art forms was made, one of the concomitants of that is that you also had an artist made for the first time. And the artist was different from the mental individual and different from the physical figure. That the artistic personality was creative. Was creative in the sense of being almost, and the word I like to use is prismatic. That the spiritual person, who's the art form of themselves, is like a jewel, has a scintillation that wouldn't be there in nature. If you look at the raw diamond out of the volcanic blue clay cone, raw diamonds don't glisten. You have to cut them. And when the jeweler cuts the diamonds, then they become jewels. In nature, diamonds are not sparkling. They have to be cut. And so what we're looking at now is the time-honored wisdom of how to cut the diamond of our person so that that artistic sparkle comes out. And though the diamond as a jewel now is what used to be called 200 years ago a transcendental form, in ancient times just called a jewel. But the transcendental form ascription to it came into play about 200 years ago. And one of the ways in which that came into play is that people at that time, just a handful, just a few, realized that what was wrong with civilizations was that they were miscut. They were not cut to bring out the jewel of social relationships in a civilization, but they were cut along lines that the mind dictated through doctrines, through ideological limitations. And so what you had was a distortion. Things were not cut along the natural facets that are really there with the art of revealing the jewel, but they were cut simply to fit the convenience of power groups who were saying, we want it this way. And so human beings were not able to mature at all, to be themselves, to be who they are, to release the spiritual person that they really are when the conscious visionary process is allowed to deliver you into form, to generate that form. And about 200 years ago, men and women across a large swath of land got fed up with this and initiated what was called and is called in history, the Age of Revolutions. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, everywhere. The saying at the time was from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. This was in intolerable situation. Who has put us this way? We must be free from this. Whatever else there is, we must be free from it. And of course, the reaction to that was always twofold. One is to disagree with that, the authorities saying, no, you're not capable. You are peasants. You're ordinary people. We have the authority, we have the experience, we have the power. We have the right to run you and your lives. Or the other side of that, and these are the horns of the dilemma, instead of disagreeing with it, they say, oh yes, you're right. Let us organize your freedom. Yeah, we'll take care of it for you. Yeah, we'll see that you get to be who you are. And look, this is the list and specifications that we have found that is really nice and you should want. And if you have all these things, well, then you're free, aren't you? Well, we'll arrange that for you. You'll have all kinds of credit. Of course, you'll have to maintain it. But we'll see that you lead the good life and that you're... And so you can see that 200 years ago, already, the horns of this dilemma were active, and one of the most precision artists of the day saw through it to the extent that his criticism of it was on a completely new level. And so, because it was a criticism on the basis of the art of visionary thinking, he called his book that first came out a critique. Because what an artist does is not just to look at the integration of the elements, of the perceptions, and bring it to some kind of an idea, some kind of a statement. That's faux art. What an artist does is exercise their visionary consciousness so that they can perform a critique of the form that has emerged so that they know when the work is really finished, when it's really there, when it really is the jewel and scintillates. The artist not only creates, but knows when that painting is finished. When that architecture, not just a structure, it's a shelter, but it's a work of architecture, and it is finished. It's ready to be inhabited. That sculpture is now exactly where it had to get to, and it is there, and there it is. The same for the person. The spiritually artistic person, when they not arrive, but when they have been turned into jewels, discover that they have a second kind of calibration that they didn't have before. No one ever told them they had this possibility. They have not only the integral calibration, but they have a new calibration I call the differential. The differential is the range of possibilities, and a spiritual person has an unlimited range of possibilities. Now, this is a very difficult thing to come to simplicity of stating, but I think after 40 years I'm able to deliver it. It'll take a while for it to sink in for you, but here it is, very simply. Nature actually is mysterious because nature occurs before existence occurs. Before there's objective existentiality, nature is a process. And the nature of that mysterious process is that change always is occurring. Sir Isaac Newton, when he first got to the mathematics of it about 300 years ago, called it fluxions. He didn't know what else to call it. Leibniz, who knew about the I Ching, called it changes. But that the changes, the fluxions, both Newton and Leibniz understood, are capable of being infinitesimally accurate indefinitely. And what is infinitesimally accurate is that in between two paired binary natural universals, 0 and 1, there are any number of subdivisions. You can't limit the number of subdivisions between 0 and 1. You can put that decimal there and you can run that decimal out forever. And that one of the most primary ratios, proportions in the world is the ratio between the radius of a circle and its area, and it's called pi. And if you want to put a mathematical quality on pi, you can. It's 3 point, and then you can run those decimals indefinitely. One of the tests on the first supercomputer in the world, it was even before UNIVAC, it was called ENIAC. And one of the tests that they ran on it to see if it was precise is they ran a test to see if it could develop mathematically the value of pi. And even on that first early computer, ENIAC, ran the decimals until they finally turned the machine off. There is no end to the infinitesimal ratioing of the diameter of a circle to a circle, and yet one can measure the circle and one can measure the diameter exactly, and that's what it is. But the ratio is infinite. So that in the differential calibration, one is not limited to integral specificity. Its unity is that the whole range of possibility is an infinite. And so while nature is a sea constantly of change between 0 and 1, visionary consciousness, is a sea of process between 0 and infinity. So that nature works by 0 and 1, and consciousness works by 0 and infinity. And where the zeros occur, they can coincide and become 1, 0. But it isn't like it's 1, 0, it's 0, 0-ness. Precisely. This is called in Zen Satori. One wakens not just to yourself, oh, gee, I'm handsome or I'm rich, or one wakens to nothing except that the entire universe is transparent as well. The zero mysteriousness of nature occurs to one in its reality before it has a unity. And so the Chinese have a wonderful word for this. They call it Tao. And that nature is a Tao. And its efficacy is to pop into existence as a unity, and the Chinese call that Te, and that they're always a pair, so that 2,500 years ago, the classic Chinese book is Tao Te Ching. Ching means book. The book of Tao Te. This is how it works. And we know now, in really advanced 21st century quantum physics, that there is in the primordial reality of the universe the ability for vacuum energy to pop into particality and also pop out of particality back into just pure dynamic and vacuum energy. And that those two states are entangled. They're linked together in a mysterious way that their entanglement, their linking, extends all the way through the reality before the universe is unified. So it is permanently infinite without being a thing. This is the source of whatever is able to dynamically drive anything coming into its existence and allowing for its existence to go back to the mysteriousness that it came from, and then come back again and not be destroyed, and go back out and then come back again, and that this process is how reality generates existence accurately. That existence is not just made and then it stays there, but it's constantly going back and forth, and we call this vibration. The billions of times of iteration in any given time period is the vibratory coupling which is there from Tao and Te together and is carried over like a child will have the traits of its parents, so that the existentials will also have the trait of that pairedness. And it took the Chinese about 250 years after Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching to understand that the Te also then has a pair, and that pair is called yin-yang. And the genius for that was a Taoist engineer, very formidable man named Tzu-Yin. And Tzu-Yin founded the Yin-Yang Chia in China about 350 BC, about the time when Plato died. So that it was now understood that Tao Te participate in such a way that the Te itself has a yin-yang entanglement, but its entanglement is not 0 and 1, but that 1 has a particular kind of an expression which is more real of it. It isn't just 1, but it can be expressed as 1 over 1. And if you express it in a ratio of 1 over 1, you keep the unity, but now the expression of it is in a form where the proportionality becomes very interesting, that if you have 1 yin and 1 yang together, you will have 1 Te. But if you have the yin and yang in the 1 over 1 with the Tao, you now have a mysterious kind of a triad that's going on. And you find in Chinese thought whole mysterious developments of schools of triads at this time. And it was such a fascinating thing that a group of very sophisticated Chinese got together under a man who would have been emperor, but he was lower on the totem pole of birth. So he was just a prince, not the emperor. He was the prince of a area of China called Huainan. And he brought together a group of about 30 or 40 people to discuss the mysteriousness of what is going on, and their records are in a book called the Huainan. You have the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, then you have the Chuangzi, and then about 150 years later, you have the Huainan. And in that, they began to recognize that Chuangzi had put his finger on something that's very interesting. That while Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching, and that it was like an angle of insight into the I Ching, his later contemporary Confucius changed the nature of the I Ching permanently because he wrote commentaries on it. Commentaries on the I Ching, they're called the 10 Wings, and any edition of the I Ching now will have incorporated Confucius's 10 Wings in the text, and you assume that it's always been there. It was put there by Confucius, but it was Chuangzi about 250 years after Lao Tzu who saw that what had happened here. You had not only Tao Te, but because now you had suddenly a capacity to have a ratioed Te, a ratioed unity of yin-yang, it meant that the yin-yang not only related to the base, to the substrate, Tao 0, but related also then to a pair, a complement of Tao, 0, and the complement was Zhen. And so while Tao was given the value of 0 and Te the value of 1, Zhen was given the value of 2. But its 2 is not the 2 of one yin and one yang. Its 2 is that it is now able to relate to the ratio of Te of 1/1 in its further unity. And so human-heartedness, Zhen, became a third phase. But Chuangzi saw something even deeper because his contemporary Mencius, who was a Confucian genius next only to Confucius and whose book is always read after you read Confucius, then you read Mencius. But Chuangzi, as a contemporary of Mencius, saw it isn't just Zhen, because the Zhen itself will have a further complement to it. Because Zhen will be like Tao, it is not a thing, but it's a process. And to Chuangzi, he saw that the process of human-heartedness is not a thing, but it's literally a play of experience. And so Chuangzi is famous for all time of discovering that in the play of human experience is born the fourth phase, symbolic thought. The symbols, the E. So that while Lao Tzu wrote about Tao Te, Chuangzi wrote about that Confucius had discovered Zhen E. But that the Zhen E could be interpreted in such a way that it limited it to the mind. So that the E was like the end product of experience, of the Zhen process. Whereas Chuangzi said, no, there's a mysterious process. We call it now vision. We call it consciousness. Chuangzi said it is a supernatural quality that is again like Tao, in that it has a zeroness to it, but instead of having the capacity to deliver unity out of that zeroness now has a paired capacity to deliver infinity. And so Chuangzi is the taproot and seed of what became Zen Buddhism. That the mysterious creative play of consciousness itself has the capacity to create forms that are infinite, not just forms that are existential or thinkable, but forms that are unthinkable and yet real, unknowable yet very true. And Chuangzi is famous for setting up the fact that now one had a Taoist energy phase where the ecology was fivefold. It ran Tao, Te, Zhen, E, Qi. The consciousness, that vision, was this mysterious dynamic energy. Not energy, but a dynamis that goes through everything. And so the qi has to be taken into consideration, the qi. And it wasn't long after the Huainanzi and all these discussions that they realized that if Tao can produce Te, can let it emerge, and the Zhen can let E emerge, then the Qi has a possibility of letting a form emerge, and they discovered that that's how art is made. Art is not existential objectivity. It's not mental objectivity. It is the differential objectivity of consciousness. And so within 100 years of the Huainanzi, one of the very powerful intellectual Han Chinese dynasty emperors realized that no one had ever talked about this, and so he held the first discussions on art in Chinese history. A big conclave of the best minds of the time, and they were held in a special part of the palace called the White Tiger Hall. And in fact, the classic discussions of the White Tiger Hall about 25 BC are translated into English. Next, when we get to art, I'll bring the 2 volumes that published in the Netherlands. That's the English translation of those discussions. And immediately that you have those discussions in the White Tiger Hall, the old form of the Han Dynasty was finished. It proved insufficient. And they had a glitch. They were experienced enough and powerful enough to bring the Han Dynasty back, but they had to bring it back in a different calibration, and so it's called the later Han. Now you have a former Han and a later Han. Because once consciousness achieves a form of understanding that is superior to the mind, mental forms are no longer at the top of the pecking order. Now it is artistic, spiritual forms that are at the top. And if they do not approve of the mental forms, of the existential forms, those existential and mental forms, those ritual forms and symbol forms, have no chance of sustaining themselves because the spirit forms are more powerful. We know now, after tens of thousands of years' experience with ourselves, it only takes one spiritually real person to change the entire world. That's the power of the Spirit. You don't have to have a majority. You don't have to have a minority. One single, mature, spiritual jeweled person can change the entire structure of all of it, to the extent that not only does it change what's there, but it recalibrates the past so that the past changes also. It no longer worked out that way, so now that has a different valuation. And so the whole past becomes what I call the new past. And it also opens up because now there are new possibilities for the future. So I always pair them, the future and the new past and the transformed present. They all go together. And while it was almost impossible at the time in China 2,000 years ago to understand this and understand just exactly how this worked, they were ready and they were susceptible to having somebody come who opened up the issues that when you have a spiritual person that has a calibration of 0 to infinity, you can now change not only the whole world, but you can change for all time, all worlds. There is now such a thing as an almost cosmic person. And the person who came to Asia, who brought first that message in 41 AD, was a man named Thomas. He's the doubting Thomas of the New Testament. He's St. Thomas. And what he brought with him, it wasn't yet Christianity. It was a poignant Hellenistic Jewish jewel that had been cut in a very special way so that the possibility now was seen that the spiritual person is infinitely refinable, and so we have to go through times of refining to see what that turns out to be, and that then is the realm of the Holy Spirit, opening up indefinitely to see how it is that we will refine, and not only ourselves, but that jewels can be brought together and make things like necklaces. So that one now has a civilization where there are groups of people who are like necklaces of beauty and scintillation. And when others see that, they realize that this is possible. And not only possible, but doable. They have done it. And so the whole development was for small communities of men and women to become necklaces of jeweled community together and perform something that had never been seen in nature before. And it was so powerful in India that the most powerful integral in India at that time, which was classic Buddhism, was transformed forever and became the Mahayana. And the first book in the Mahayana the Shraddhapada Sutra of Ashvaghosha, about 90 AD, it translates into English, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. You can read every Buddhist sutra. You never see them use the word faith. Whereas the Hellenistic Jews and the early Christians used the term faith, pistis. It means the preparation so that you will accept the transform out of your former limitations and release the new energy so that the spirit form can begin its refining, which can go on indefinitely. And one finds this in India at the time. Ashvaghosha wrote his Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana at the same time that the first Hermetic treatise was written, and that the book of Revelation was written by St. John, and that several other things. One collection is called the Odes of Solomon. There are 42 of them. And they're spiritual songs that form a necklace, and they call it the Odes of Solomon because it's the kind of necklace that a Solomonic king would present to his beloved to adorn her. The one adorned is Sophia, wisdom, with this necklace of linked odes, of linked songs. And so one has about 90 AD, one of the brightest spots in planetary history. All over the planet, one is finding people awakening to new possibilities. That not only is there an awakening of faith that it is possible, but also that there are techniques available now for us to do it, and that it's even grander if we do it together. Now the old forms of kingdoms are finished forever, and new possibilities of community have been released. But the old authorities don't go quietly. And they use that double technique of co-opting to missteer it, or of denying it and suppress it. And so it's taken about 2,000 years for that to work itself out. We live at a time where it's finally working itself to where the margin of distance between theory and practice is now reaching a coinciding. Part of this education is to prepare a population of people so that when that coincides in the next 10 years, we'll be able to live it. Let's take a break. Let's come back to something that's interesting. It is always a shock for someone who becomes conscious that they discover that the mind is limited. Not that it's limited. The right way to say it is that the mind is an integral structure. And so it is best said of it, as Schiller said 200 years ago, in the 19th letter. We're taking Schiller's letters on the aesthetic education of man and pairing it with some mystical women's writings from the 1100s. And the reason why we're pairing books is to still use books, because the mind that we have to work with was formed on books for the last 2,000 years. And the context in which we have to work, the civilization, the culture, the history, was all formed with books. And so to have any chance to have a way to get a handle on it is we have to still remain familiar with books. Now in the future, this will not be as necessary and will progressively be less so, but for us it's still necessary. But books 300 years ago became versions of a condensation that got energized and became textbooks. And those textbooks over 300 years have devolved down to being just inculcating doctrinaire manuals which instruct but don't allow you to learn. You can memorize rote-wise, but you can't remember things that are conscious. You can't read between the lines. In fact, you can't even read the lines. You just read by the signal code that has been instructed to you, and you've been tested on it. Did you get our code? Are you reading our material the way we want you to read it? Fine, you get an A. We're pairing books also because when you pair things, as you see, you get a proportion. You get proportionality. You get a ratioing. And that invites, in its own appeal, for you to do not only compare and contrast, but paralleling, and also eventually then seeing that there are complex forms. And that complex forms, really complex forms, are not made of ratios anymore, but they're made of sets of resonance. And when you mature to the point to where you're able to see forms as sets of resonance, another capacity comes into play. And that is that these sets of resonance are directly correspondent to the vibrational way in which they really exist out of nature. That their existential vibratory calibration, the iteration of their particular energy frequency, is tunable to the resonant sets of the spiritual person's discrimination. And you know now that so many vibrations in such a time period will give you a wavelength that is just so long, and if this wavelength is just so, then light will be red. If it's a little bit different from that, the light will be orange. And different yet, it will be blue. And that with the red, one can get to blinks where the red becomes invisible to see, and you get infrared. It is still there, and with the right technology, one can see in infrared. This is a learning that is 21st century sophistication that allows you to calibrate to see the entire electromagnetic spectrum into its infinity on both ends. And to also discover that because you are able yourself to encompass this scale, you yourself then must also be infinite and available for any number of possibilities. This constitutes freedom. Not the freedom of choice, and not just the freedom to be, and not just the freedom to achieve individuality, but the freedom to participate in a kaleidoscopic way with an infinite cosmos, because the resonance sets calibrate themselves into a harmonic. And while on the level of art one can have a critique, on the level of science you can have an analytic. And an analytic is indefinitely refinable. You can find out more and more about more and more, evermore. That sort of thing. Schiller, in the 19th letter, written in 1795, he was trying to express to someone in a series of letters why it is that there is a new way to look at intelligence that is not limited to the mind. It is a transcendental intelligence and not a rational intelligence that's limited to the mind. And so he says at this point, this is a translation from the German, at this point we must remind ourselves that we are dealing with a finite, not with an infinite mind. The finite mind is that which cannot become active except through being passive, which only attains to the absolute by means of limitation, and only acts and fashions inasmuch as it receives material to fashion. So that the finite mind naturally tends to limit itself practically to what is materially there in the world. And if it isn't materially there in the world, then it probably isn't that important. And right away, the tendency is to think that then things that are trans nature, supernatural, will interfere with nature, and one has to watch out for that. Not only that they might be supernatural demons that are bad, but they might be supernatural angels that might be terrifying. They don't always bring good news. They don't always carry flowers. Sometimes they carry swords. And fighting with demons sometimes is easier than to think that you could fight with angels. Much less something lurking that is so monumental that one hates to even broach the possibility, and that is that you might, in some way, have become an enemy of God. Forget the demons and forget the angels. Now you have problems. There is no health plan to cover that. And so the quality 200 years ago was when the American Revolution triggered the French Revolution, triggered a whole revolution across the face of North America and Europe. All that time, in the background, a genius thinker named Kant, Immanuel Kant, we've talked about, came up with a transcendental philosophy, and the classic book for it was called The Critique. Notice the art term. The Critique of Pure Reason. He spent 10 years working on it. He did nothing else but that. It's called his silent years. He was a professor in a little trading city called Königsberg, which is on the Baltic Sea, across the bay from what used to be called Danzig in Poland, and now it's called Gdansk, a big ship-making port in Poland on the Baltic Sea. And across the bay is Königsberg. It is so unusual a place that today that land around Königsberg is not a part of Poland, it's not a part of Lithuania, but it's a part of Russia because they didn't want to ever let it go. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, they held on to Königsberg because it's a very special place. It is strategic. If you go across the Baltic, you come to Sweden. If you just curve a little bit, you come to Denmark. You can go to northern Germany. You can go to Poland. You can go to all the Baltic states. You can go to all the Scandinavian states. And the tie line that holds that is not Moscow, but St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg is named for Peter the Great. Not a communist, but an empire builder. He's the one that made Imperial Russia, Peter the Great. This is his city. And to keep an imperial city, you have to have strategic outposts, colonies, like the British Empire had Hong Kong. Imperial Russia's Hong Kong is there in Königsberg, and that's where Kant lived all his life. Now, what's interesting is that Kant's grandfather was Scottish, came from Scotland. But he lived in the 17th century, the 1600s, and you had to, in order to make your way, if you weren't in the church and you weren't in some kind of court or something, if you were a working merchant, you had to be in a guild. And so Kant's grandfather was in a guild of leather workers, specifically saddle makers and harness makers. They made saddles and harnesses for horses and did a fairly good business. And so Kant's father was raised to be a guild member. And when Kant himself was born, he wasn't born a philosopher, he was born a natural guild member of saddle makers and harness makers. Though he never did it, he had the right to do that. And so it gave him a social position in his town. One of the difficulties, though, is that the young Kant was precociously intelligent. Not just somebody who's a little intelligent, I mean precocious. They say that somebody that has an IQ of like 130 begins to be like very bright. And somebody who's like 140 is getting towards Mensa stuff. Kant was one of these people that had like a 200 IQ. Unbelievable. And it bothered him in such a way because he was too bright to be sociable. It wasn't that he saw through people, but he saw that people were like little versions of what they really were and what they could be. And then when he looked at himself, he saw that, well, I'm still a little version of what I could be. And so most of his concern, his energy, didn't go into making saddles, but going in to find out how he could release himself and be the size that he was. And all during a period of about 20 years, he became a professor at the university in Königsberg. He gave lectures. He wrote interesting titled papers and books. And then he wrote nothing for 10 years. Because he began to become staggered that he had come upon something. And what he had come upon is that the mind, even though it is finite, if you allow it to have transcendental domains that have emerged from it, those domains, when they develop forms, will be able to unite those transcendental forms with the mind, and the mind will be able to be more than what it was in nature. It will become a supernatural mind. But not supernatural in like hocus pocus, supernatural in the ability to go to an advanced philosophical context of an expanded consciousness. Now in Königsberg, in Europe at this time, this was pretty esoteric, pretty difficult. But in places like India, this is standard yogic practice. There are many comparisons of Kant with the Vedantic Shankara in that school in India. In fact, one of the great early translators of the Critique of Pure Reason into English was a Sanskrit scholar, Max Muller, who's famous for his translation of the Rig Veda into German and into some English. Max Muller was one of the first Sanskrit scholars in the world, and he was there at Oxford University and was the star. He had a beautiful wife who was in social demand, and so Muller was like, he was like an intellectual king in Oxford with his beautiful wife, his fantastic learning. His translation of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason alerted people in the English language that they had missed out on Kant completely. That while Europe was torn as pro-Kant and anti-Kant. The pro-Kant people were largely German. The anti-Kant were largely French. The British and Americans had just ignored all this. Well, this is not anything. And yet, the American experience of it was completely Kantian, although people didn't know it. Because one of the great admirers of that whole era in Europe, a British man named Thomas Carlyle, he wrote a lot of books. He wrote a life of Schiller. He also wrote a big history of the French Revolution. That's one of the great classics, and about 30 other books. His favorite correspondent was in America, outside of Boston, in Concord, was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Carlyle and Emerson, in their correspondence that fills a whole huge book, Carlyle's understanding of Schiller allowed him to get a deep understanding of Kant's transcendental mind and passed it on to Emerson, who founded American Transcendentalism. So the American Transcendentalists, that whole movement is a Kantian version developed in America where they didn't even know it. I had no understanding whatsoever. Because they were sealed off from going to Schiller because Schiller had been mischaracterized, both by the French who were against this This is German vague mysticism. Or sabotaged by the Germans who said, oh, this is the very stuff that we want, but we need to develop it further, and it became really vague and really metaphysical. And so the precision of Schiller was blurred in both ways, and the Americans just completely ignored him. Had no idea. Schiller is like some kind of metaphysical, He wrote a few great poems, and he wrote a few great dramas, and we should maybe know that he was like an important poet in literature from that period, but that's it. Nobody looked at the letters of aesthetic education because it's dynamite. Because what he's saying in here, all political forms are reductive ideological projections and never involve consciousness or spiritual persons. If you have political forms, you are automatically unpersonal, impersonal, and fear consciousness. And so it becomes an adjunct of all political ideologies to be anti-intellectual in the sense that you don't want people to be conscious. And you don't want them to be farther than just individual, where they're going to fight to stay and get their share of our pie. What happens if they develop that they have a taste that doesn't need pie? They can get fed elsewhere. Then you lose your authority, and then politics becomes a matter of the refinement of the person. It becomes aesthetic rather than political. So human freedom becomes aesthetic in its forms rather than political in its forms. Now, this is a challenge across the board to authority everywhere. This is revolutionary talk. Kant himself, 6 years after he brought out the Critique of Pure Reason, brought out a second edition because he read his own work and realized that he had not seen the full extent to where this really goes somewhere big. And so the second edition in 1787 was published on the 100th anniversary of Newton's Principia Mathematica, 1687, which is the beginning of modern math and modern physics, modern astronomy, modern science, the Newtonian universe. And it was Kant's favorite when he was growing up all these times. In 1687, he was in his mid-60s. He found a philosophy that fit the Newtonian universe. That there are transcendental realms that are accessible to us, but in order to do so, we have to quiet the mind so it doesn't boss us around to the extent of telling us, don't go there, don't think that. And we have to counsel the body so it doesn't get jittery, because the body is willing to go, but it usually waits for the mind to agree. And if the mind is saying don't go there, the body starts to get ill, nauseous, fearful, phobic. Because your spirit is leading you beyond the mind, and the body is trying to go there, and the mind is saying no, 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 no. So the body begins to get ill and phobic and nauseous and fearful. Oh my God, maybe we're heading for death. Maybe we're heading for madness. And so by the time of Schiller, all of this whole entourage of stuff came in to play and became a new style, as they used to say in universities, a new style of cultural expression. Romanticism, the Romantic Revolution, where man is no longer just content to be an individual, but he wants to be on the adventure of an infinite life, and he's willing to be a protagonist in the struggle against fear and terror, especially of the overwhelming corralling of the mind. He's willing to go on these heroic adventures, heroic quests. And all of a sudden he finds that he is like an individual who was an ancient Paleolithic shaman, only now he's trying to do that within a culture, a civilization that either sees him as somebody that has to be repressed or as somebody that has to be co-opted because they have good energy, but we want that energy for our reinstatement, cleverly, of our authority. And so you get this interplay. In France, the person who co-opted the French Revolution, who said, oh yes, of course, the people should have this power and I will guarantee that they will have this power because I will get it for them, was Napoleon. Yeah, the little emperor. Oh, and he was clever. He never called himself an emperor. He said, I'm just the first citizen. Because he realized that Augustus Caesar, who founded the Roman Empire, never called himself emperor. He called himself the princeps, the first man. And so the Roman Empire, in its technical term, when it was founded, was called the Roman Principate, not the Roman Empire. And Augustus was very clear. He said, I have all this power, and I'm willing to share it with you. But if you want to know what my opinion is, you have to ask me first, and then you can decide if you're going to agree with me or disagree with me. And I have 20 legions, and I have all this land. He owned Egypt as a personal possession, where most of the food came from. Well, I have food, and I have legions, and I have authority, and I have killed a lot of people. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. And that's how the Roman Empire was founded. Napoleon did that in France, tried to do that in France. He said, look at all these enemies that we had, and who do you think took the French armies into victory? Who else? And because they were colossal victories, they were melodramatic, because another hero of his was Alexander the Great, who used to specialize in getting dramatic battles so that you didn't just defeat the enemy, but you obliterated their ability to argue against you forever. And so Napoleon, after 5 or 6 victories that were dashing, his cavalry had the red capes, the plumed hats, and the epaulets, and the badges, and the swords. And when the battle was certainly won because of the infantry, he would bring the cavalry in with all the Napoleonic flashing stuff so that they could finish up, and then they could take the credit later on at all the wine, dancing, honorable balls. That's right, we crushed those people at Austerlitz. We just decimated them. We're the new empire. And the French style is called the Empire style, the furniture, the fashions. Schiller, when he first wrote the aesthetic letters, printed them in a magazine that he was editing with Goethe, one of the geniuses of all time. But Goethe was a classicist. He liked things to be classically Greek in their balance, and that everything has to be very clear. Goethe had no sympathy for the Greek mystery religions. He had this overwhelming confidence that if everything were kept very classically clear in outline, balanced, traditional, that then all the capacities of man would have nice little categorical places to keep themselves. But he and Schiller, though they were different, shared the genius of poetry and eventually lived within 20 miles of each other. And by the time that Schiller, towards the end of a period of teaching at the University of Jena, about 20 miles from Weimar, where Goethe was the prime minister for decades and ran everything. Schiller, who had never been very healthy, got quite ill and eventually died in his mid-40s in 1805. But he realized, as he was dying, that he had to represent the aesthetic letters in a really powerful way. And so the text that we have now, the book that we have now, these letters are enormously refined and present one of the great revolutionary declarations in human history. The declaration that we don't know how to make a final community of human beings, because as everyone grows and refines, the possibilities will also expand, and it may be that in the future, those men and women will look upon our best efforts as kindergarten stuff. So the best that we can do is deliver enough capacity to them so that they can get to wherever they have to be and not be corralled by the fears of the past and the overwhelming ambitions of the present, or the lurking snares of planned futures by all these power groups. So that human beings now have to be given an infinite freedom to discover who they might be, not just who they are. We talked last week about the phrase that when Moses was on Mount Horeb, and in his vision was told by God to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses says, well, who shall I say sent them? And the traditional translation was, I am that I am. Whereas there's another translation available, if you put it into a differential grammar, it translates, I will be who I will be. Not that as the medium between I ams, but the who in between will be's, so that one now has an infinite God. Not just some icon of power, but the promise of indefinite freedom. Is a whole different look at divinity. And Schiller, in trying to find a way to express himself, not only wrote these books, but he was one of the greatest poets of all time, and he found a way to express himself that became a classic. And he wrote a poem which was so revolutionary right at the end of his life that Beethoven chose it as the text for his Ninth Symphony. It's called Hymn to Joy. Unfortunately, it's a 19th century translation, but just to give you a little bit, the chorus at one point in Hymn to Joy reads, homage to sacred sympathy, get the resonances? Homage to sacred sympathy, all ye within creation's ring, up to you, yon star pavilions, leads to the unknown king. Now this is not only Schiller, but is very poignantly the best of old Kant as well. Because Kant, in addition to being one of the greatest philosophers of all time, was the first person to speculate that not all the lights in the skies are stars, that there are some bright patches in the sky that are not stars. They were called nebula, clouds. But Kant was the first to say, these are not clouds. These are constellations of millions of stars that are so far away that we can't see the individual stars. He's the first to realize they are galaxies, and that all the stars that we see are part of one galaxy only. And that we have to school ourselves not to let the limited mind project its ideologies not only onto people, but onto God. And out of this, of course, someone like Beethoven, when he met Goethe, was a wild genius. One time, Beethoven and Goethe were walking together down one of the main streets of Weimar. And who comes riding Down the street is Napoleon with his red cape and his empire decorations, his plumed hat, his sword, his officers, bon vivant. And so Goethe tugs on Beethoven's arm and says, we better get off the street. And Beethoven said, no, let them get off the street. We're walking. That's a Schiller outlook. More next week.